This is Naturpodden, the podcast about nature, and we are live from SciFest Uppsala with Herman Orizaola. Most welcome.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you for inviting me to be here. Always a pleasure to be in science communication activities and telling people what we do on our research daily life. Yeah.
And today we are going to talk about something rather special. Radioactive frogs, and we will talk a bit more about that in a bit. I just wanted to say that we really would like to have some questions later on. So if you have a question, you can just raise your hand. But Herman, could you tell me a bit more about these so-called radioactive frogs of Chernobyl?
Yeah. It's part of the research I'm doing at Uppsala University, But when we talk about Chernobyl, I mean, probably a lot of people know what we're talking about. But Chernobyl is a place that is located in Ukraine.
Do you know about Chernobyl?
Yeah.
You do?
So it's 1,200 kilometers from here. So closer than Paris, for example. And on the 70s and early 80s, it used to be one of the largest nuclear power factories in the world. So they were creating all the energy that Ukraine and all the countries around was consumed with nuclear power plants. But something that happens on the 1986 is that during a test, one of the reactors exploded in a way and released a huge amount of radioactivity to the environment.
1986?
1986, almost 32 years ago. So
do you remember 1986? So, just a minute.
Yep.
Were you alive 1986? No. So for some people in the audience, they weren't actually alive when this event took place.
Exactly, but one of the things with radioactivity is most of the radioactive substances, they have extremely long life. So you have things like uranium and plutonium that is thousands of years until they are sort of degraded. And others like cesium or whatever is 30, 40 years. So all those substances that were released 32 years ago, there are most of them still on the environments. Some others disappear.
So when they are long-lived, you mean that they are still active in some way?
Yeah, exactly, they are active.
And in which way are they active when we talk about living organisms?
Yeah, what happens with radioactivity and living organisms is like all these radionuclides, all these radioactive substances, they could harm your DNA. So the basis of the life, how it works, that is DNA, when it's hit by one of those atoms of radioactive substances, is breaking. And different things can happen. If too much of your DNA is broken, you will die. Or your cells will die. If it's not too much, your cells could repair all that damage.
Okay.
So you are always between that balance of a huge impact, of a sort of an impact that can be repaired by your cells.
Okay, so we have 1986, we have this disaster with a nuclear power plant. We still have substances that are still actively radioactive.
Yep.
And then you have been traveling to this area to do research. Could you tell us something about what your research questions are?
Yeah, something that happened with Chernobyl is that at the time of the accident, so late 80s, and a huge release of radionuclides. So the idea was that all the area around Chernobyl and all the areas that were also affected, they will become a nuclear wasteland. So, and it's quite popular to have all these areas in movies populated by zombies and mutants and things like that. So the main idea was that area will be empty of any kind of life forms for centuries and for even thousands of years. But what happens really quick, I mean, after 1 or 2 years, is that people start moving around that area and finding wolves, bears, bisons, lynxes, all kind of birds, amphibians, and so. And of course, doesn't make sense. You either are on a nuclear desert for life, or you are in an area just with wolves and lynxes and bears. So what we try to do is to understand what's happening there.
Okay, so perhaps we should ask the audience. I got an idea here.
Yeah.
So let's see with the audience. Do you think that the accident at Chernobyl 1986, do you think that it has killed off all animals? You said that there were some animals coming into the area, like wolves and lynx and so on. How do you think the accident has affected the amphibians in the area? Do you know what amphibians are? Like frogs and toads and stuff? Any ideas? What do you think? Was it good or bad for the animals? Radioactivity. Perhaps you have an idea.
Since you asked, maybe it was good.
So Herman, was it good or bad for the amphibians, the disaster?
Well, we still don't know. What is true is that that area is now full of amphibians, and not just amphibians, all kind of animals. So we still don't know what happened. If it was a big impact at the very beginning, but then animals are able to cope with the radioactivity levels on that area right now, or if I've started even to be adapted to live with a bit of radiation. Something that also happens, and it's really, really important to mention here, is when the accident happened, all the area around the nuclear power plant, that is an area almost as big as from here to Stockholm, was empty of humans. There was a creation of exclusion zone.
So it's like a deserted wasteland.
Well, it's not wasteland, it's a desert for humans. There are no
Desert
humans.
from humans.
So it's an area that actually has been repopulated by trees, for example, and there's a question over there.
Yes.
But you did go there. Were you scared to go there?
If I'm scared going there, no. No, this exclusion zone is a huge area, but only a few small places within the area are still really highly contaminated. So, and we still visit those areas. So, just to put some numbers into how contaminated that area is. Last year in 2017, we were there inside this exclusion zone for more than a week, almost 10 days. So we go always with a dosimeter, that is a sort of a small machine that records all the radioactivity you have been exposed to. So during those days, we were exposed to something that is called 100 microsieverts, whatever the number, 100 units. So when you go to the dentist and they made a dental plate for you, that's 5 microsieverts. Even when you eat a banana, we have a banana there, it's so 10 bananas is 1 microsievert.
And you said this was the most radioactive fruit.
Yeah, it's the most radioactive sort of food item you could you could eat, bananas. So that's, but if you travel by plane, so I have some numbers here. You drive from New York to LA by plane, it's 40 microsieverts. So almost half of all the exposure you get being more than a week in Chernobyl doing research. So actually you are exposed to pretty low levels of radiation. It's much higher than here. Here should be 0.02 per hour. And some areas in Chernobyl at 100, 200 microsievert per hour. But still you are just for a few hours, for a few days. So it doesn't make any big difference on the final count.
But
so it's okay.
That also means that the numbers that the animals are exposed to is in the same kind of, at least, vicinity as the natural background radiation level in some areas.
Yeah, it depends how much they move and where they live. But of course there are some areas that it's as clean as this room, and some areas that are much more sort of contaminated. But the thing is, even on those really highly contaminated areas, it's still a lot of frogs and a lot of animals. So we have been sampling less than a kilometer from the nuclear power plant, from the reactor that exploded, with pretty high radiation levels. And still it's full of frogs and wild boars and eagles and all kind of animals. So we wanted to understand how they do that are doing fine, are doing not super fine, but considering that there are no humans around, is still fine. So are we humans worse than radioactivity for animals? And that's I think the more sad, but the more important question.
Okay, yeah, let's dwell on that for a bit. And I've read a paper about barn swallows in Chernobyl that was published not too long after the catastrophe, saying that the rate of abnormalities among barn swallows was higher in this area compared to a reference zone in Ukraine, I think.
Yep.
So is that something you have read?
Yeah, it's. I mean, the barn swallow is probably the species that has been more studied in Chernobyl. There's a group by Anders Moller and Tim Musso that have been studying all kind of organisms, but especially barn swallows in Chernobyl since the early 90s.
Do you know barn swallows? Ladusvala in Swedish. The one with a long tail.
Yep.
So what kind of abnormalities did the barn swallows have?
They have found things like albinism in many organisms.
You know albinism? You know.
White feathers here and there. Also more tumors, some more cancer.
More cancer.
In some of those animals. And also lower abundances of those animals in the more contaminated areas. But on the other side, there is other studies and find it more animals in the contaminated areas. That tells you also that different animals have different susceptibilities.
Okay. Yeah, and the follow-up question would be, did the amphibians also have more abnormalities? Do they have more abnormalities?
I mean, not really. The only thing we have found that is a bit unusual is more black individuals. We work with tree frogs, so the Lufgruda here in Sweden, that are normally super green, brilliant green.
Perhaps you don't know this species because it's a really, really green frog that occurs in Skåne.
So it's as green as this, almost.
And it's got this. It can climb.
Fingers, sticky fingers that just climb. So in Chernobyl, almost 25% of the population is black.
Does that even occur in Sweden?
Gray. I mean, the thing is, it's a different species. It's not exactly the same species as the one we have here in Sweden.
Okay.
And it looks like it everywhere in other areas, this species, that is the oriental tree frog or the eastern tree frog, is much more variable in coloration. But still, it's something that it's, in a way, unusual. And we know black coloration, so melanin, so the pigment that protects you from UV radiation, the radiation produced by the sun, is good for blocking that radiation. So being black may be good for living in a radioactive environment. But that's the only thing that it's pretty obvious to the plain sight when you are in Chernobyl that is maybe different. But we find those frogs in all kind of areas. So in the contaminated areas and also in the clean areas. Apart from that, there's nothing really obvious. But of course, we go much deeper than the really obvious things. So we are looking at the genomics of those species. If they are, in a way, affected by the radiation, or if they have started to respond in a way that those mutations could be also beneficial mutations that allows those frogs to survive better in a radioactive environment. So we are looking at all the kind of things.
Okay, so are there more DNA mutations in these frogs in the zone?
We don't know.
You don't know yet?
We still don't know, no.
You're waiting for the data to come.
Exactly, we are just going there. I mean, it's something that when you do research, it's something that you have to learn. Research needs patience, and you need to go really step by step, do a good sampling in the environment. So you really need to go to all kind of places, contaminated places, non-contaminated places, have good sample sizes in both environments. So have a really good sampling of what's happening there, then go to the lab, go to all these processes that you need to do on the lab. So it takes time. It takes time, a lot of patience, and it's not easy in many ways. So it's people working with me. I have to also mention that it's Pablo Burraco is the person that is doing all this kind of research in the lab, day by day, with a lot of patience, repeating things that don't work. So it takes time. And we are on the way of knowing what's happening, but still we don't know what happens.
Okay. Have you published any paper yet from this Chernobyl zone, or is it all
Not
in progress?
yet about. It's in progress.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
about. So we are looking at things like how your immune system is changed if you
Yeah.
live in a radioactive environment, how the microorganisms living in your skin can change in function of the radioactivity in the environment, how things like how fast you age in relation with the environment in which you are living, because that's something that happens. So you may look fine, but you age faster on a more stressful environment. So that's something that we will have the data next week, I guess.
Okay.
We are just almost finished with that on the lab.
Interesting. So after the disaster, people expected this area to become a wasteland, but it seems today at least that it's become more like a wildlife refuge
Absolutely.
area.
Yep.
That is really interesting. So, and perhaps you almost suggested that the people moving out was more important than radiation kind of moving in.
Yeah, I mean, just to put in an example, we know what happens with wolves in Sweden, for example. How not liked are the wolves in many areas. And there was a situation in Chernobyl before the accident. So it was an area with 300,000 people living there, a lot of agricultural, of course, a lot of industry, a lot of people moving around.
So that's
hunting.
more people than living in Uppsala.
Exactly. So hunting and so on. So every single wolf that was around has a really high chances of being shot and killed. Of course, when you remove these 300,000 people and leave all this space for wildlife, for wolves, what you ended up is with a population of a few hundred wolves living in the area, in a way, happily without humans.
A few hundred.
Yeah, a few hundred,
So that's the same.
400.
400. So that's as many wolves in the Chernobyl area as lives in Sweden today.
Yeah, and it's an area that is as big as from here to Stockholm.
Okay.
As to put it into perspective.
Yeah, that's a nice perspective.
So removing humans, we know, is quite beneficial in many cases for wildlife. And that's been the case for wolves, been the case for brown bears, bisons, and many other organisms. You need to think that when you put humans out of the environment, you put out noise, hunting, herbicides, pesticides, sort of all kind of nasty chemicals. So a lot of things that really harm wildlife. And then when you have on the balance all the negative effects of humans and the negative effects of radioactivity, and you see that probably removing humans cause more positive effects than still having radioactivity on the environment.
That's quite unexpected, isn't it? Removing humans has a larger effect. Do we have any follow-up question on that one?
Yes, I got a question. You talked about this one specific kind of frog.
Yep.
Do you see any kind of difference compared to, like, obvious they sound different, or like they move in a different way, or some things like that?
I mean, not really. As I said, the only thing a bit different is the coloration, but nothing that is really obvious. So, I mean, this year, for example, we are going back in May, and one of the things that we would like to study is, as you said, the sound. Because you could think that more stressed individuals, so individuals living on a radioactive contaminated area, they could, for example, invest a bit less in reproduction or a bit more. So that could relate it to different quality of the calls that the males are doing for attracting females. So that's something that we want to investigate this year. But as I said, there's nothing really obvious, and not just on this species of frog, but there are other species around when we are walking, so fire-bellied toads or pool frogs, and all the kind of species. All look fine, as far as I can tell. So then when you go into the inside, we'll see, but it all look fine. And populations are sort of big. It's not that you find a few frogs here and there. There is just frogs everywhere and in big numbers. So that's as I said, it's a bit counterintuitive, but it's a kind of thing we want to know how is this happening.
That's really something. So we are really waiting for the DNA data to come then. What I wanted to ask you is about these tree frogs. There was a black variant, black morph,
Yep.
and a green one. That sounds a bit like the Swedish viper,
Yep.
where you have a black form and a gray form with this zigzag pattern on the back. Do you have anybody looked into the vipers in the area, and are there more black?
No, not
morphs?
really. Not really. I mean, we know that sort of black coloration in general, even here in Sweden, is a really good adaptation to live in a cold climate. So for animals like frogs or reptiles that are not able to regulate the temperature in their bodies, they need to regulate it through the sun, to being exposed to sun. And once you are black, you know, when you are wearing black, you're warm much faster. So exactly like you now. So many organisms, when they live in really high altitudes or latitudes, like here in Sweden, they are darker than in more kind of tropical areas. That's part of the case with the Swedish others and many other
Adders, yes.
others. Also, the pool frogs are much darker here in Uppland than in Central Europe, for example. And that can be also the case with those frogs living in Chernobyl. Chernobyl is quite a cold environment. I mean, right now, as cold as it is here, with a bit of snow and quite minus degrees. So that could be also an adaptation for living in cold climates. We don't know exactly.
Okay, so I want to go back to this DNA mutation. So a fundamental thing in biology is that mutations might be good if you happen to get an adaptive mutation, but most mutations are supposed to be negative. So there are all these systems trying to decrease the number of mutations, DNA mutations. In what kind of way are you trying to investigate this in using this area?
Yep. So yes, as I said, I mean, once a mutation is caused, there is two options, and it could be really harmful, and then the cell die, and if many cells die, the organism died. But also, all those mutations can be repaired, and can be repaired with no errors. All this DNA damage, sorry. So it can be repaired with no errors, so no mutation happens. Or there could be a mutation. As you said, it could be beneficials, could be neutral mutations, it could be harmful mutations. So we want to investigate this. I mean, for example, one way in which we will investigate this, we have samples from just after the accident, 1987, 1988, of some frogs. So going to those very same species and looking at the genome right now, they will give us a pretty good idea of how many mutations those frogs have accumulated over these 30 years, and also where on the genome those mutations occurs, and trying to see if there are on the big changes on some of genes that are important for your life functions or not, or if those mutations are neutral and it's no big effect. So that's one of the, I think, the ways in which research in Chernobyl or other radioactive contaminated areas should go.
Interesting. We have a question here.
The radioactivity that occurs in nature, is it an important driving force for the mutations that are needed in evolution?
Well, not really, because radiation levels with no background radiation levels are really low. So it's they are not causing a big number of mutation or any mutation at all. So it's not really a driving force. Again, I mean, radioactivity is quite complex. So what we call background radiation is not the same here than if you go to some places in India or northern Canada, which can be a few orders of magnitude higher, just natural background radiation, because the soil, I mean, the rocks in the soil are different. And different soils, they produce different natural background radiation. So even that is different. It's quite substantially different in natural conditions. So it depends a lot. So radiation levels are quite low here, but it could be quite high in some areas. As I said, you go to some places in India.
So that's interesting. So a thought experiment. What would have happened if these 300 people that were moved out of the area just stay put instead?
300,000 people.
In the Chernobyl area?
Chernobyl area. Well, it's something that is debate, and there have been a recent study that sort of recalculated how much exposure to radiation that people would have experienced if they were not moved from Chernobyl. And actually, it's quite an interesting study. The conclusion is that we'll be exposed to really relatively low radiation levels for most of them. I mean, of course, when the accident happened, there was a huge radiation for the first people that went there. Firefighters that were to extinguish the fire. So, of course, there were casualties from the very beginning, and there's a number of a few dozens, so even 100, 200 people that were killed in just a few weeks. But there were, in a way, the heroes that stopped the fire on the nuclear power plant, and they prevented that this was even a larger accident. So that was a huge impact in humans. And of course, people in the area were exposed to high radiation levels on the first days. So there are some compounds like iodine that it's, for example, causing thyroid cancer that are active just on the first days and the first weeks, and then disappear from the environment, but they are really harmful. So the level of thyroid cancer has been high, much higher in the areas affected by the accident in Belarus and Ukraine over the last 30 years. So that was a big effect on humans. And if anyone wants to know about the human effects, there is a recent Nobel laureate, so Svetlana Alexievich. They have a book called Voices of Chernobyl that is all about the human effects of the accident. Both humans that experience the radiation, the negative effects of radiation, but also humans that were affected by moving out of the normal lives, moving out of the daily routines, back to a completely different environment. They were not their environment. And for many years in their countries, they were a bit strange people. They were kind of refugees inside their own country because they were moved out from an area that was supposed to be contaminated by radiation. So it was not just the physical, but also the psychological effects of the accident that were pretty big. And in a way that could have been caused by moving all the people out of the exclusion zone. But of course, there was 1986, there was the Soviet Union, and the way of reasoning and the way of working and function at that time was different. So we gained a lot of knowledge, for example, from that accident, about how one of those accidents should be managed. And I guess all the big accident that happened during this time, there was in Japan, Fukushima, so 7 years ago. I think it was handled much better. So casualties were almost none by the direct accident, and really few or if any, by the direct exposure. So it was pretty much better managed. So it's
So it's hard to go and question animals about the psychological effects of the Chernobyl accident, but you said that humans had this short-term effect, that it was kind of some humans were exposed to very high levels of radioactivity, and some other substances that are more short-lived.
Yep.
Can one see the same thing in animals, or has there been any research on the short term, just close to the accident? Or was it even accessible for research back then?
It wasn't really. It wasn't, or not much. Still, some of the Soviet researchers were there for, really short visits, say a year, 2 years after the accident. So we have small hints of what happened there. And of course, the effects look like it were much bigger at that time than the effect that we can see or cannot see right now. So quite probably, I mean, the effects, especially in some areas, were pretty big. We know that the effects were pretty big on trees, for example. So the area that was more affected by the explosion was an area that is called the Red Forest. And it's called the Red Forest because it used to be a pine forest. It was so badly affected by radiation that all the trees become red. So all the leaves become red, and for quite a few years, that area was just kind of copper red. So it was kind of quite heavily affected, and most of those trees died, and they were replaced a few years later by other species even, so by birch that is more resistant to radiation. So
Okay.
we know there was big effects at the beginning, of course, yeah.
Okay, and of course, plant could be a way of accessing short-term history as well. I
Yep.
mean, because if they're still alive, they couldn't move
Yeah, yeah.
in the same way. That's really interesting. So it has been really nice talking about Chernobyl and the radioactivity and amphibians with you. I just wanted to say that, or ask you, you have been here in Sweden for quite some time now,
Yep.
and you have been really open to this kind of public outreach events, and we have really appreciated that. And it's with sadness in my heart that I've learned that you are moving out of the country.
Yep, I'm moving to, back to Spain in a way, after many years, to a new position at the University of Oviedo and the Research Institute of Biodiversity there, keeping with the same sort of research and quite probably still doing research here. Because something that also happened, we haven't mentioned, with a Chernobyl accident, is that Sweden was quite affected.
Yes.
So Sweden and Norway were the area more severely affected by radioactivity, apart from Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. Because the radioactive cloud that came from the accident just moved around Europe, and at some time on the late April, it was over Sweden. At the same time, there was rain. So a big area, a bit north of Uppsala, around Gävle, and a bit further north, was kind of heavily affected by radiation. So we also...
And it's still affected.
And it's still affected in a way. So wild boar that are hunted in that area still have quite high levels of radiation in the meat. So
Have you heard about that? The wild boars, vildsvin?
Yep.
Yeah.
So actually some are above the levels that are allowed for human consume.
Okay.
So we want to look at those wild boars. We want to look also at the frogs that are living on those environments, trying to see there's some kind of responses that could be seen in Chernobyl are also seen here in the Swedish frogs, living on the areas that were more affected by the nuclear fallout in the 80s. Same with wild boars and so. So even if I'm going abroad of the country in more sort of location way, I will be back for doing this kind of research. And still always happy to do science communication activities, because I think that's something that we researchers in Sweden are even forced by law to do. Our researchers in Sweden should do, at university, should do teaching, research, and communication. Most of researchers don't do communication, and I think that's something that is absolutely fundamental.
We will call those researchers.
Please do.
Do we have any final question? We have
Yep.
one question.
This is like one thought, but have you seen like the same causes from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, like from this?
That's a good question.
haven't-
Hiroshima and Nagasaki, have they seen the same effects, or is
No.
there a difference there?
No, I mean, just to put also numbers again into perspective, the radiation that was released by the accident in Chernobyl is equivalent to, it's not clear, 400 nuclear bombs like the one fall in Hiroshima. So it's a huge difference. But also it's quite different in the way that Hiroshima was released just in a second, while all the radiation in Chernobyl was released over 10 days. So it all complicates the analysis. But of course, it was much more harmful in many ways, Hiroshima, than Chernobyl. So Hiroshima bombed, it killed directly many thousands of people. or on the few weeks and months. So in many respects, it was much more harmful, Hiroshima or Nagasaki nuclear bombs, than Chernobyl or Fukushima accidents. And that's also the sad part of the nuclear world, that they could be also used in this extremely harmful way as nuclear weapons. So that's a big difference. And of course, this also happened on the 40s, so not much research was conducted on the wildlife. So it was more focused on humans, much less on wildlife. So there's nothing really that we know about the effects of those bombs in wildlife.
Okay, so there has been no follow-up from those places and from the places where they have tried to explode atom bombs.
Do nuclear tests. No.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. So that's why it's so important that you continue to do your work in Chernobyl and in other areas. So thank you very much, Herman Orizaola, for coming and talk to us today.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for being here and asking questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.